So I am formerly a diplomat of Uganda. I trained, after my career, I went and trained as a diplomat. So I was not a political appointee, but I trained as a diplomat. And I worked as a diplomat of Uganda for 13 years until for my own reasons, I decided that I don't want to work as a diplomat any longer. And I left. And when I left, I became an academician, and I also became a manager, consultant in international development. And those are the things I'm still preoccupied with till now. I'm also infatuated with democratic change in Uganda. That's why I'm actually here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'll stick to the Martin, Karen and Remy. Karen, I'll start with you. In an article that was authored about this time last year, and I'll quote you from that article. It was about Genie at Crossroads. You said in the lines that start, when they killed my son, they killed me too. I would have preferred it if you'd have left him alive and killed me instead. With regards to Uganda's case, do you think this looks like it's coming from, it could be put in any part of Africa? What do you think as Human Rights Watch, as Advocacy Director for Africa, we could do to stop the same story going on in every country?
Well, that's a very serious question. And it's a question that I think lives with all of us, not just with Human Rights Watch, but also with any advocate. Martin just said that he's infatuated with the issue of democratization in Uganda. And I think every peace lover, every activist, every researcher has that question in mind. But let me just, I think I would like to reference something. I hope that our discussion will not focus on how the West can end the deteriorating human rights situation in Uganda, but rather how Ugandans can leverage their agency, technological savvy, and resilience to bring those to the fore in order to uncover and push for change, to uncover serious human rights abuses. And let me just, from a Human Rights Watch standpoint, we've worked in Uganda since the 90s, actually. So there's a whole body of work, whole body of advocacy, even before I joined Human Rights Watch, which I joined in 2018. And I think what we've covered, when you look at the different issues, there's certain themes that keep coming back. The killings, extrajudicial killings by security forces, arrest and beatings of opposition supporters and journalists, disruption of opposition rallies. Now, we also have the weaponization of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we also covered and documented, and the instrumentalization of the internet. And I think it's also important to highlight the fact that what we document and expose has already been uncovered and documented by local partners, by organizations on the ground. And what we do essentially is threefold, and I'm going to respond to your question now. First off, we attempt as much as possible to provide an environment in which the international community, in this case, Uganda and Uganda development partners, is aware that serious human rights violations are committed, and we try to avoid a situation where those abuses are hidden, because that's what governments will tend to do, is to hide, and they increasingly have become very sophisticated at that. The second thing we try to do is to provide an environment where abuses are documented, which is, I think documentation is very important, and preserved for justice and accountability purposes, whether it's in terms of current processes or future processes. And finally, we try to work as much as possible with local partners to elevate and amplify their voices. And we advocate for the restoration of, ultimately, the victim's dignity and their right to obtain justice and ultimately break cycles of impunity. As I said, we've worked for a long time in Uganda, and I'll never forget, I was reading an article just immediately after joining Human Rights Watch, trying to accustom myself with some of the work that we had done in the 90s. And I'll never forget, I read an article, rather a statement by a former Uganda researcher. And he had this to say, and it's very interesting. It was in 1999. Government harassment and discriminatory legislation are suppressing independent political activity in Uganda. Uganda has become the darling of the Western powers, but Uganda is moving away from democracy, not towards it. And at that time, as you know, more than I do, the ruling party, the NRM, had structured an environment where there was just a movement. It was called the movement. And my former colleague had to say that the political system was inherently hostile to democratic freedoms. That was in 1999, very current today. Let me just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, for that background. I would like to bring in Remy. Remy, I know you've fallen prey, so to speak, to the harassment of the regime of Museveni. I know you have been arrested a couple of times when you've gone to report about the former presidential candidate 2016 Besigye. What can you just share a little bit of your experience being a reporter, putting yourself on the line, and facing the dictators, as Karen has just said, the things that are being done on the continent, it's just history repeating itself in every country. It's just moving from one country to another, one regime to another. Remy, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ismail. First of all, before I go into my story, I would like to denounce the serious human rights violations in Uganda. And I urge President Museveni's government to cease from such abuses, to abstain from these acts of intimidation, acts of revenge, and to urgently come out and guarantee accountability for all human rights violations, which have been broadly denounced worldwide. The world is watching, actually. So having said that, personally, I've been a victim, like you've just stated it, yes. I was arrested on live television covering the former presidential candidate, Dr. Kizza Besigye. And my crime was to tell us if the events as they happened shortly after the 2016 elections. I was tortured, I was beaten, I was jailed, I was harassed, I was intimidated. I felt like I even sued the government for abusing my freedom as a journalist. And that's why today you see me speaking strongly about everyone who comes out to attack journalists, because we do not deserve such kind of treatment. The United Nations got involved. I went to Gambia at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights just to narrate my experience. I called upon the Commissioner, the African Union, to intervene in Uganda and support the female journalists whose dignity is being abused by I call them goons because they harassed me. So the goons in the police force. I don't think we have trained police officers in Uganda. So all these acts, incidents against the female journalists, against all journalists, really are heartbreaking. And today I feel very happy when I had Karen coming out to condemn and saying Uganda is a darling of the Western world. But I mean, what needs to be done? This is the question that we need to be addressing today, because I know people have tried, the human rights defenders have tried to intervene, but all these are working under I don't know how, like, for lack of a better word, I'll say, let me just say, they're working under dire circumstances in Uganda. So what needs to be done today? This is what we should be responding to.
Thank you very much, Remy. And speaking about being a darling, in 1987, 2 years after Museveni and his people took over, and I quote, he met President Ronald Reagan, and this is what President Ronald Reagan said: "Pleasure to meet you. I know your concern and progress you are making with regard to human rights." Martin, the word for me is the concern. We have somebody, Remy, who's just shared her story of being tortured and by the goons that she calls them. Do you think the West or still and even if Karen says that we need to the darling, there's a lot of funding that keeps going on to these countries, and Uganda in particular. I know that the U.S. government gives the Ugandan government about $950 million US that goes into a couple of different projects. So, Martin, what's your take on this current state of affairs, especially with the word, for me, the word concern and progress, they shouldn't be in the same line as regards to Museveni and human rights.
You see, the world has now known that one of the most cunning leaders of our time is Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. Yoweri Museveni of Uganda has earned that moniker and earned it so well. He's one of the most cunning individuals that this world has ever seen. When he grabbed power in 1986, he grabbed power on false premises. He built a facade that he was a freedom fighter fighting for the rights of others. It was a facade, and the world bought it. And they thought that's what it was. That's why you see Reagan saying, "Pleased to meet you. I share your concern." He didn't know he was dealing with a lying man. This liar had built a facade, knowing that this facade resonates with the Western democracies because their values are human rights, respect for human rights, and democratization. So he built a facade meant to con, C-O-N, to con the Western world so that it can then fund him, accept him, and fund him to become bigger and actualize his intentions. Fast forward today, we have got negative progress, not positive progress, negative progress. The facade has unraveled. There has been exposure of a true Museveni. And this is the historic importance of Honorable Robert Sentamu Kyagulanyi. The exposure of the facade. That point now must go in world books as the historical relevancy of the politics of Honorable Kyagulanyi. Now, the other point, and this I took when Ms. Kaneza was speaking, the idea of integrity, the idea of what was it? Yes, integrity. And yes, because you see, when we talk human rights, man and animal are the same. We are all mammals. However, human beings are above animals because we got integrity. It is that integrity which gives us humanness. If anybody undermines that integrity, we lose our humanness. We are de-animalized. We are dehumanized and become animalized. We are at that same level. there is essentially a problem in our cultures. And one of that problem in our culture is power relations. We have a problem of big men, big manism. These big men, we got it from the kings. This is a political legacy of the kings. Now, the political leaders who come today want to be like the kings of yore. They want to behave like they have. That is why we have impunity, concentration of power with these small people, and they think they can rule with impunity. Now, the cure to that is democracy, because democracy, other than concentrating power, it dissipates the power amongst the people. What can the West do? We shall start from there.
Thank you very much, Martin. I want to bring in Karen. As a person who is coming from Burundi, before I even speak Burundi, we know what's going on with, right now that's going on with Saudi Arabia. We know what's going on with Ethiopia. We know what's going on with Somalia. And most recently, what happened with Rwanda, the extrajudicial thing that's going on down there. We get a feeling that the world bodies and nobody, and for the case of Khashoggi, who was murdered blatantly, when all the evidences, just like how the evidences in your article that you authored last year, just like the evidences of brutal killings, arrests, and of Remy, the world bodies, they keep watching and watching and waiting. Do you think, what would you say is if somebody says that the world bodies are promoting the impunity? With all the examples that I've said above, what would you say if somebody had a school of thought like that?
I would say that, well, a couple of things. I think the world is dynamic. I think we are dynamic human beings. I think world powers are also dynamic. It would not be far-fetched to say that if we're going to look at the African continent, right? You mentioned Ethiopia, there's Sudan as well, Mali,
Somalia,
right?
Senegal just started a couple of hours ago.
Right? And if you look at the 60s, where the continent was, the agitation, the pre-independence agitation, and then there was another wave of agitation around military dictatorship, especially in West Africa, and how countries, governments themselves, managed to bring out a new political discourse where today, when you have an invasion of a country or a disruption around elections, you do have sometimes blocs like ECOWAS who would, for instance, say, this is unacceptable because it's against our protocol on governance, elections, and democracy. And they would rein in for time at times. It's not perfect. But today, when you look at where we are with the mass protest, civic protest that we see across the continent, then one wonders, are we seeing a pre-independence era that is resurging right now, driven by the people, shaped and forged by the people on the ground? You mentioned Burundi, same story. And I think, and that's going to be another point I would like to bring out, is the fact that we mentioned that, for instance, Human Rights Watch has worked in Uganda for many years. We're actually working in 25 sub-Saharan countries. What have we learned? And I think I'm going to try to respond to some of Remy and Martin's questions, because it's also my question, right? What do we do now? Where are we heading? But in terms of forging a path forward, we need to think of what have we learned. And I think it's important to remember that we've learned about the resilience of African civil society organizations. I'm from a country where in the 90s, you couldn't really talk about a civil society or an independent media. Today, some of the media organizations are in exile. Why? Because they have claimed and exercised their right to freedom of expression, right? So the resilience is one thing we have to remember. The other point we have to maybe work more on is the need for stronger, more strategic collaboration amongst ourselves. Because you mentioned about, multilateral institutions promoting impunity, but if they are promoting impunity, it's because they are able to do that. You do have African leaders banding together, but where are the people? When you have La Lucha in the DRC, you have Ballet Citoyen, you have Yanama, you have Sindhu Muja, you have in Zimbabwe a whole coalition of Zimbabwean activists. Where are we in terms of fostering those relations in order to be stronger? So that's one of the lessons learned, I believe. The other lesson learned is how the extent to which we leverage African mechanisms. Because we talk about the African Union, but let's remember that our worst obstructions, as we said, come from African leaders. But let's remember that, for instance, in November 2020, the commissioner, the African commissioner responsible for monitoring the human rights situation in Uganda, and who's also the chairperson of the working group on the death penalty, extrajudicial, summary, and arbitrary execution in Africa, together with a special rapporteur on prison conditions of detention and policing in Africa, issued a very strong statement calling on the Ugandan authorities to take measures to actually put an end to the use of notably deadly weapons, conducting impartial and independent investigations. So there are things that are being done. The question we need to ask ourselves is, to what extent do we leverage those mechanisms? I think the other last point I would like to make is the fact that there is a shift to a certain degree between the relations of blocs like the European Union or even the US. Recently, when you remember the discussions around targeted sanctions that have been brought forward by US senators, there is a shift. Now, to what extent the Ugandan diaspora, and that is a question to you, Ismail, is linking up with US think tanks, the African American diaspora? To what extent are we leveraging the fact that you have a significant number of Ugandans who are living in the US or in Europe to actually leverage those relationships, to actually push those multilateral institutions to take a stance? It's really about, are we on the right side of history? And if indeed we're going to talk about human rights, and Martin said something very interesting. He said, what is at the core of the concept of human rights? And by the way, it's essentially an African concept. we always tend to forget. It might have been encapsulated better in the West, but human rights are fundamentally Africans. So how do we then extract those fundamental values and put them on the table at the African Union? The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as I just mentioned, have done and are still doing a lot of work. Obviously, the obstruction from political organs will always be there. But this is some work we need to, there's more work to be done. Essentially, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to what are the Ugandans in their diaspora doing? Just even being part of this platform, it's among the many things that we're doing. And just to let you know, we have, and among the people that are on here, it's Andrea Baron. I won't ask her to come on, and other people that we work with, and a couple of other people who work with think tanks. We have teams that help to get in touch with senators, representatives, and everybody. But still, like you said, where is the resilience? And being in the diaspora as it is, it's not. Maybe Remy will tell us her experience. It's not there is so much you can do when you're here. And just today, when we get off this call, we were having a very big demonstration somewhere in Walton. But do those things shake the dictators? That would be the most important question. And to you, Remy, she talked about resilience and coalitions. What do you think resilience coalitions? And I know that with the last couple of times, you've had journalists that are being beaten. Why is it that even after journalists are being beaten, they go back to report about the same issues? Why don't you people take a stance and say no, just like Karen was saying? What would it take for something like that?
Well, yeah, so I'm very deeply concerned by the deteriorating circumstances in which laws are enforced in Uganda. We all have seen journalists being beaten. I have been there. I was assaulted myself, and this continues. It doesn't stop. It's becoming more of a habit. We remember you saw the IGP, the Inspector General of Police, coming out to say, we beat journalists so we can instill some sense into their heads. Who does that? Who says something like that, especially when you're a power holder like an IGP? I think we need to put a stop to this. And journalists in Uganda cannot help themselves. We've dragged government to court, but these courts are being controlled by the government. What needs to be done? I think we need to be looking at the international bodies like the United Nations, of course, that received several petitions because these abuses have been going on and nothing has been done. We have a UN Human Rights Commission office in Uganda. What they need to do, actually, to me, I feel like the UN officer needs to write a detailed report, and he needs to prioritize monitoring of the entire situation in Uganda. Let this report be presented to the UN Council for debate. Let the member countries, of which Uganda is also a member country to the United Nations, and we have a permanent representative.
I'm sorry, Remy. Do you think a dictator like Museveni, like Kagame, would be scared by a report written by a UN representative in their country? Do you think that is something that would check them?
It's not something that can be checked, but resolutions can be adopted. For example, if we have countries like America, and these are the people who promote democracy, promote human rights, if they cut off they stop this relationship, Uganda-US relationship, that would impact Uganda, which is a developing country, and of which a quick number of the budget is funded by donors. If all donors came up and said, we are not going to promote impunity in this country, we are going to stop working with Uganda, that will affect Museveni's government. If travel bans are issued, if sanctions are issued against those abusing the human rights in Uganda, I feel that will have a big impact. Ismail, there are no basic protections for the abusers enshrined in the Constitution, but as someone who covered Parliament for 6 years, I know that the civilians, Ugandans, are protected by the Constitution. Article 24 requires respect for human dignity and provides, says that no one should be subjected to any kind of inhumane treatment, cruel torture. So Ugandans are protected. So these laws are not being enforced. Museveni's government has become more repressive, and everyone, they're crushing political dissent. So the world should intervene. The human rights situation in Uganda needs attention from the Western powers, the superpowers especially.
Thank you very much, Remy. Last week, we were privileged to have Karen, your family friend, Sylvia Mbabazi. She was with us here last week. And when I told her that you're on this show, she was really excited. And one of the things, while she was sharing with her very vast legal experience, she has worked with the ICC and all these other places. And one of the people who chartered the human rights charter in Uganda and sat on a number of boards. One of the things that she noted is the willingness, the will for the what Remy calls the superpowers to intervene. Like, again, we can sit here and call for the banning of the for the bans and sanctions, which is fine. But, and just like the person we had from RRI last week, Jacob, he said we can talk banning, stopping the aid, but it's not Museveni and his gang that will be affected. It's the person in the village down there that probably would get that. So, Martin, do you think the West? So who do we have to run to, the West or ourselves? Because Karen says we have to stand up. It's the resilience. We need to make more coalitions, because this looks like it's our call. Martin.
Yes, in these circumstances, I always talk about constituencies for change. Change basically has two constituencies in this matter. The first constituency is what I call the domestic constituents, which Karen referred to as the people at home, the human rights activists and all those, the people at home. Those are the primary constituents. Their resilience in this matter counts a lot. It's the key. When the primary constituency is resilient, when the primary constituency is vibrant, when the primary constituency has people like Honorable Kyagulanyi, they produce an agenda. That agenda is what the international community acts upon. However, and I will re-emphasize, if the primary constituents, if the domestic constituency is not resilient, the agenda will never be manifested. The agenda will never be exposed to the international world. So primarily, the people on ground must resist it. They must be resilient. They must produce that agenda. They help to expose the impunity. When Mr. Kyagulanyi was going around and he was being shot with live bullets and all that, this was great exposure. The international community got to know the impunity of Ugandan authorities, the barbarity with which they were going about society's management. It all got exposed out there. Now, when it comes to the international community, what matters is in which mood is the international community. I use the word mood. When nationalists take over governments in the West, matters are not good for some of our countries. When nationalists like Trump and those other people take over power in these countries, matters are very bad for our countries because they don't care about them. It's about them. For example, America first. For example, we don't need our troops out there. We need them at home. As whole countries, nobody cares about you. Goes to the question of leverage. How do you leverage? You must understand the political dynamics of countries where you are based at, or countries in the West. For example, now in the United States, we have an advantage. The liberals have taken over. America is back. Now, the mood of the international relations is internationalism, not isolationism, but internationalism. Before this, Angela Merkel was alone with the French trying to revive internationalism. Now America is back. Internationalism is back. For example, Africans now should be jubilating. And you see immediately, COVAX, the vaccine is available now. America has put $2 billion to make the whole thing move again. I don't know what would happen if Trump was still in office. Already, you know, he had taken money out of World Health Organization. So we in Africa must interest ourselves in international relations. Now, what are the diaspora doing? What about other people? Engagement. Do you engage with international actors at bilateral and multilateral levels to interest them in what is going on back home? What are the modalities of engagement? Do you protest or do you relax? When you protest, people react. So when you engage, like I know here in the United States, the diaspora is actively engaging the legislature because the diaspora has understood, and really we should give kudos to the diaspora leaders, Uganda diaspora leaders out here. They have understood that there is a difference between state interests and the interests of that country. The interests of the state of America, the interests in White House, are not the same interests like those in the Congress. The people right now bothering us with Uganda is the Pentagon state. No, we must deal with the strong man because you see the strong man, he subjugates, the strong man, he gets us the peace. That is wrong.
Martin, I want to bring in, sorry, I want to bring in Karen at that particular point. Because in her article, again, which I'm going to quote again, Karen, you said, the government should unequivocally recognize and ensure respect for fundamental right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression for all Guineans. It should punish members of the security forces, other perpetrators of abuses. To do so, the Guinea authorities should set up special legal unit and document. Now, with the case of Uganda, the documentation is there. There's a lot of video, audio. What next with all the documentation that the people have? What should people do with it? Because all just like Richard was saying, all the international actors, they know, they see, but also still with the way the politics is going. One time it's Uganda, now Ethiopia is more. Whatever is going on in Ethiopia, I'm not trying to pour water on it, is center stage, and with respect to whatever is going on. So what can Ugandans do with the documentation that they have?
Okay, of course, as usual, this is a very difficult question because it's what you can do many things, right? But let's try to think of what is feasible and what might yield some sort of results, right? Let's remember that while I was listening to Martin, I just remembered that when the protest in Sudan started, no one believed that an al-Bashir would have been ousted. No one. And I think it's important sometimes to remember those historical events. But anyway, moving on, I think there are
It's for you to be you.
a multi-pronged approach. The first one is to utilize the existing laws and regulations that are and international conventions that are there. And I'm going to give an example. For instance, if one is to think of agitating and advocating for cooperation agreements on peace and security operations, counterterrorism operations, in which, for instance, Uganda is a member and receiving assistance from the US. There is what is called the Lihi Law, right? And Martin, I'm sure is aware of that, which includes specific clauses setting out human rights standards, which is rarely enforced. Could one envision a calibrated action in pushing for that? especially coming from the diaspora in the US. The other action is really moving from at the domestic level and thinking of regional mechanisms. There is an early warning unit within the African Union. They have developed human rights indicators. Obviously, throughout, human rights indicators that should be applied in situations of conflict or instability across the continent. To what extent are we engaging with that department? With other partners, we've started to have a discussion around how do they apply these human rights indicators? How does that inform some of the African Union's decision? And moving forward from developing human rights indicators, when you look at, for instance, Remy, through her story and the story of others, the pervasive culture of impunity which surrounds the operations of security forces, national security forces. Should we now start forging and pushing for the development of indicators around the politicization of national security forces on the continent, so that we push organs like the African Union to actually come to terms with the fact that when, for instance, they talk about the silencing of the guns initiative, some of you may have heard about that initiative, which is embedded within the African Union, part of its Agenda 2063, has its own special rapporteur, special envoy. To what extent does that initiative, which looks at the illicit flows, right, of small arms, light weapons, in and out of the continent, but an important segment, an important part of the proliferation of those weapons have been left out? Was it done deliberately? We don't know, because no one has maybe raised the issue. This is some of the work that partners on the ground, international organizations like us, regional organizations like the Pan-African Lawyers Union should actually embark on. So regional, international, looking at what are the bilateral relations between Uganda or any other African country with the United States, with the European Union. Now, as you know, there's the Magnitsky Act now, which is a global sanction regime, which one can actually also leverage. So let me just stop here, but yeah.
Karen, I want you to, African Union with the human rights indicators, do you think the dictators should, because like you know how African Union works, it's first of all could be led by one of the most revered dictator. So how do you expect the African Union, and it hasn't come out with not even one statement, not even a tweet to the effect, say, of Ethiopia, of Uganda. So how do you envision people to reach out to African Union for human rights? They might be having them on paper, but with everything going on in Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, wherever, Senegal, one tweet, zero.
Yeah. I believe the lack of our expectation that they're not going to do anything enables them to continue to do the same thing. I think, and I agree with you, that like some, most people would say, right now we're seeing an African Union that is really almost like a gentleman's club, right? Where crises occur, there's no statement. You mentioned Ethiopia. We have other countries, Western governments really raising their voices. But at the same time, I wonder, and I guess it's a question for all of us, I wonder to what extent have we pushed the African Union? Have we put them at task? To what extent have we gone to those offices and say, when the African Union was established, the first mandate they had was to fight against apartheid and colonization. But today, the average African men and women are now being recolonized by their own people. There's no big difference between the shrinking of the abuses that are being committed with what our forefathers had to fight against. To what extent are we pushing that narrative against the African Union? That is the question that I'm asking.
Remy, to what extent should the African media be pushing the African Union to that narrative?
That's right.
Remy, over to you.
You know, what's so funny is the African Union headquarters are in the Gambia. That's in West Africa. Gambia is one of the countries that actually violates the rights of its own people. I was in Gambia to cover a story, and you won't believe what I witnessed there. I didn't have a press pass. I was an international journalist in Gambia, and I was appearing like on a high-level panel with the African Union Human Rights Commissioner. But when I went on the street to capture images, all of a sudden, the police in Gambia came and arrested me and my cameraman. They detained us for some few minutes. And later on, they told us to delete the footage. I talked to fellow journalists at this convention, and this told me that in Gambia, households have to watch the state TV. If they break into your house or just walk in and find you watching a different TV station where people who are actually watching dissenting voices, they arrest you. And this is where the African Union Commission sits. So to what extent are we pushing the African Union? I'm very sure they know the abuses going on in different countries, and this resonates to Uganda. There is a lot of brutality and repression deployed by the regime that has led to high levels of civil insecurity among Ugandans. There is this generalized brutality of citizens with impunity, which needs to stop. There is this imposition of the state of fear and criminalization of social protests against the basics. And we've also seen selective detentions of people coming up to support Bobby Wine, to support Besigye. Anyone who comes up to oppose the government is detained. So to me, I feel we need to take advantage of the unwavering positioning and actions of, the actors from the universal human rights bodies vis-a-vis the situation in Uganda, the European Union, the African Union, the United Nations, and all those actors playing a big part in promoting human rights need to be brought on board. And this will be more instrumental in giving prominency to the issues at the international level. If they issue sanctions, this will be documented. Because Ugandans, even though you say Ugandans need to be resilient, Uganda needs to speak up. No one wants to die. And this is the narrative Museveni's government has set. This rhetoric where he comes out every time and again to say that everyone who condemns whatever the actions of the police and his security forces is trying to destabilize peace. This is the rhetoric we have been hearing again and again. And I feel like it needs to stop. The impunity needs to be condemned. Thank you, Esma.
Thank you very much, Remy. And Karen, I don't know if you know, but a couple of weeks ago, we had a very strong online campaign to stop MTV Best Awards. I don't know if you heard about that. It was a very huge deal. The dictator has a way of cleansing after doing the dirty work, and then he sets up this thing. So for Uganda's case, he had planned, very well planned, to say, let me beat up these guys. And then a couple of weeks, then I'll show the world, look, it's not too bad. I mean, I have these guys that are, and they were supposed to host DJ Khaled. So Ugandans, to me, in the diaspora and everywhere, they're trying, just like Remy has said, and just like Martin, doing their best. We only need, I think the question now would be, to what extent are bodies like Human Rights Watch, For the case of the MTV Best, I don't think Human Rights Watch wrote a letter or an email. I don't think UN wrote a letter on. It's the people that went out on social media and put these guys to task. We have a team that wrote emails and had Zoom meetings just like this one to tell them, look, guys, this should not happen. And they stopped it. So the question would be, as we wind down, Martin and then Karen, to what extent should the bodies, human rights bodies, intervene? We know they are also working in fear in these countries. Just you saw what happened in Congo. The ambassador of Italy was killed. To what extent should they help the Ugandans maybe get a Sudan, just like Karen was talking about? Martin, please.
Well, as I said before,
as we wind down.
Yeah, as I said before, I think our societies now have some good hope because the mood of internationalism, or the mood of the world, has changed. We now have internationalism obtaining as a paradigm for international activity. And in this, it means that values like respect for human rights and democratization have now come back to the fore, which means that powerful countries in the West and other entities will not simply focus on their interests while dealing with our big men, but instead look at what extent those big men are respecting values. So values now have come back, and those values are going to temper the relationship which focused on interests alone. So we in Uganda and everywhere should find this very good news. In fact, some actors on the international stage from Uganda have already started seeing this. It's now a lot easier, for example, to have a conversation with the National Security Administrator of the National Security Advisor of Mr. Biden than it was before, because then in those times which have just ended, you'd be seen as someone from the asshole countries who is trying to, who doesn't know what they are talking about. Now, the other issues we have, of course, more tangible tools. And I'm glad that our friend Andrea Barron is here. The weapon of the Magnitsky Act is very effective, very potent. And we must take note that Magnitsky Act is particularly very important because it helps to fight the big man syndrome of Africa. If the big man goes to the embassy and is denied a visa, then he is deflated. The big man becomes a small man now. And perception, the society starts looking at him like he has found an equalizer at last. And that big man will start to know that the world does not end around his community, but it's a lot larger. And it will temper his behavior towards his people, because that big man will now know that there are people elsewhere who care how you handle your people. Magnitsky Act is so effective because it kills the impunity of the big men. So we are going to go ahead with that tool and use it much more effectively.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry, yeah. I have to bring in Karen. Karen, thank you. I've seen you've shared in the chat a link documenting the beating of journalists and how they deserve justice. Please go on, whoever is online. I'll also share the link with a couple of other people. Karen, to what extent should the bodies, the international bodies, intervene and help Ugandans maybe get a Sudan, quote unquote? Maybe, again, you will say it's
maybe not get it to a Sudan. That's not part of our mandate.
Yeah, no, of course.
Let me clarify that. But definitely, I think organizations like Human Rights Watch cannot do what they do if they don't have partners and they don't work hand in hand with civic organizations on the ground. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank profusely Remy and her colleagues. We would not be doing what we do had we not, been informed or encouraged or activated by the work that yourself and others are doing. And I also want to say that we mentioned the diaspora. I've mentioned how civil society organizations have evolved on the continent. Diaspora groups as well. So let me just also say a big thank you to Ismail and his colleagues and members of the Ugandan diaspora in the US and elsewhere for the incredible advocacy that you've done so far. I guess the question is, how do we just amplify what is already being done? And I think for an organization like Human Rights Watch is to creatively use the experience and the leverage that we already have in these different, vis-a-vis these different institutions, putting to making it more visible, making visible and explaining, unpacking these different mechanisms that Martin and myself have mentioned, right? We're talking about the Magnitsky Act. We're talking about the Leahy Law. We're talking about there's now a discussion around the sanction regime led by, as part of a discussion between the US and the African Union. These compliance mechanisms that are on paper, but which we can leverage to actually bring them into existence. Because at some point, mechanisms like the ICC were just on paper. It took years of advocacy, years of discussions to get to the to forge and establish an assembly of state parties. There's a lot of work to be done, and sometimes it takes years to see actually progress in terms of justice and accountability. But it's worth the try when we see some of the few results on which we hung on in order to continue our work. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Few results, a few years, something to hang on. I don't know if families that have lost people, that have lost loved ones, whose loved ones are being tortured, have the luxury to wait a few years. But thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for accepting the invite. And for those who are live with us, most of the people are live on YouTube. Thank you very much. And Facebook. We'll continue this discussion online. Karen, I see already somebody saying we need to invite you back. Thank you very much, Remy. Remy, they're saying very nice things about you too. So the discussion is good. I think that we just like Karen said, just like Martin and Remy, we need to keep the discussions going. And from us to you, please keep safe. Thank you and have a good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.